Okay, good morning everyone. The huge crowds have gathered here this morning. Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody for coming along. I am Juho from CCUS, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here, and thanks to our colleagues at GCCA for co-hosting this series of events with us. This morning's agenda is on creating CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, which of course is a key aspect of the whole carbon management chain and development. It's particularly important for the cement sector, of course, because it's even though yesterday we heard about one company getting involved in potentially in a short pipeline, that's not going to be the case in the cement industry as a whole, and companies in the sector will want there to be a service of CO2 being transported and stored by others, and so this is what today's event is all about. These are the four events that we have been that we planned together with GCCA. Yesterday we had the first one, and today is the second one in the series. And just to note that tomorrow we have a deeper dive in enabling policy frameworks and incentives. And then on Wednesday morning at the same hour, we will be talking about the carbon management challenge that will be launched or discussed today at the high-level panel, presidency panel, tomorrow afternoon. And then on Wednesday we have a chance to discuss it amongst us, industry, different organizations, and see what we can do to drive it forward. And today's agenda, I will in a second invite Claude Lorea from GCCA to give her welcome and an opening shot from the industry side on the strategic need for CO2 infrastructure. And then we have a great panel here, which Tim Dixon will lead, Tim from IEAGHG, and we will let Tim introduce the panel then when we get to that. Okay, with that, Claude, over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joe, and good day, everyone. So I'm just going to give an introduction to try to sum up what is our overall industry view on that need for CO2 infrastructure. And I just have a couple of slides. I think sometimes it helps to focus the mind, certainly at 9 in the morning. If we think of the widespread development, and I haven't put again our roadmap because I think that by now, after 3 events yesterday, everyone knows that 36% of our emission reduction rely on CO2, and basically that means at the end of the day that almost every cement plant will need a CCS and will actually need transport and storage infrastructure. Transport and storage either to a storage site or to a use option, because we are still looking very much also into the use option, and we heard yesterday from some companies that we have plants that are located where there is no storage solution, and I think that's important to keep in mind. And this is where I want really to highlight what is probably a specificity of the cement industry. But so there is almost a cement plant in every country in the world. We are usually close to our natural resources, which is limestone. It's abundant, but still the plants would be located near the raw materials. So it also means that our plants are not always in the hubs, in the clusters. We are not always next to an energy source. We are not always next to a steel plant or a chemical plant, right? So even for use option, many of our plants are quite isolated compared to other sectors. But now, having said that, if infrastructure is built, our view is that it will not only serve our industry, it will serve society more generally and infrastructure development more generally. The second thing that we believe is essential and is still lacking in many parts of the world is the mapping of the CO2 infrastructure, both pipeline and storage and use, and both onshore and offshore storage capacity. And then I think I would like to push into the debate today as well a few other issues that are, to my view, also linked to the transport and infrastructure debate. It's the public acceptance issue, because it's also part of building this infrastructure, and might be why also at some places in the world we are lagging behind in terms of developing the infrastructure. The liability issues that are maybe not clear for everyone and not fully solved. Permitting processes. Sometimes I fear that we may well be ready as the cement industry with the technology, with the capture, and then what do we do with the CO2 we have captured? And then I also believe it's part of the infrastructure debate, and we heard it yesterday. It's absolutely essential to us is the access to renewable energy. We heard yesterday the story of this Heidelberg plant that is on the Slit Island, where they said, well, now, luckily, there is some good news linked to bad news, but there is some good news with the providing renewable energy to that plant. But I also see part of the infrastructure discussion is the renewable energy access. And that's it, basically. I mean, when I mean transport, it could be pipeline, ships, trucks, train, whatever. So we have all the options for transport as well to look at. That's a short, but that was the plan.
Thank you very much. So thanks, Claude. Thanks for that introduction. Are you joining us on the panel at the front? Yes. Excellent. So thanks for the introduction. My name's Tim Dixon, IEAGHG, and it's my honour to moderate this great panel today. We have Katherine Romanak, who's a senior research scientist at the University of Texas. Sorry, Professor Katherine Romanak. It's a new title that she's got. Beth Valiaho, who's the Vice President for Policy at the International CCS Knowledge Centre in Canada. Julien Perez, who's Vice President for Policy and Strategy at the OGCI. Claude, Lorea, who we've just had presenting. And Alex Milward, who's the Director of CCUS at the UK Government Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. Thank you very much for being on the panel today. And so we're going to address this topic of transport, CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, the need for this and building it and creating it. So on that theme, we'll start first with you, Alex. And it's the chicken and egg question. Which do you do first, the transport and storage infrastructure or the capture plant? People don't want to build capture until they've got access to transport and storage. People don't want to build transport and storage until they know they've got customers with CO2 that needs to be taken. So is it the same mic to...
Hi, thank you. As everyone knows, it's the genius of the and. It's not the chicken or the egg. You need them both at the same time, rather than the heresy of the or. And one thing in the UK we've learned from our past attempts at getting the CCUS industry going is to really look at the different components. So if we sort of simplify it into the capture side and the transport and storage side, we've disaggregated those in this time round. But that does create the bit of the chicken and the egg catch-22 dilemma. So we've done a lot of work with private sector investors to work out who bears what risk. And in this context, we've decided that the government is best placed to maintain the cross-chain risk, such that if, let's pick a price point of $1 billion per major capture project, which in the UK we're asking the private sector to bear that development risk, and we want 4 or 5 of those projects to be connected to a single store. Private sector investors are only going to want to make that investment if they're confident the store is there, or in the event that the geology doesn't quite do what it says it's going to do, which sometimes it doesn't, as we've seen, then their risk is protected. So we have a series of protections in our structure of business model which protects the capture side from what we call that cross-chain risk. And likewise, the storage company and the investors there with a significant amount of investment required in that, and ours is all offshore, so that's very expensive, and for private sectors to do that investment, they want to be sure that the capture projects will have done their duty and arrived on time. And if there's a mismatch in the plans, which big infrastructure always goes to schedule to budget, doesn't it? But if in the unlikely event there's a mismatch in the plans, then again government bears that risk in protecting the transport and storage providers and making sure that they can get their recovery. And so there's a lot of detailed negotiations going on at the moment as to who bears what risk, what cost, where's the line of that, and we're in very detailed dotting the I's and crossing the T's and a lot of that, with the hopefully third time lucky launch successfully in the UK this time.
Thank you very much, Alex. And the UK is interesting because of this model. They're going straight to the hub and cluster approach rather than a point source CO2 to a single storage site, as other countries have done. So it's a very interesting model to watch and to follow. But so that's the hub and cluster model, creating infrastructure for everyone to tie into. On the same theme of hubs, so OGCI have got this excellent exercise in mapping hubs around the world. So Julien, can I ask you about the global status of hubs and your mapping exercise, and the relevance of those and your OGCI work to the cement industry in particular?
Thanks a lot, Tim, and again, just to concur with what Alex just said. So we've been participating to one of the hub in the UK, which is now called East Coast Cluster, but at the time it was Net Zero Teesside. It was some times ago. It has expanded quite massively, and it's quite interesting to see this model that the UK has followed, starting with a hub, but that has all of a sudden expanded, because when you start to de-risk a number of steps of the project, then you have a number of emitters that are interested to participate to the project. And so you start with a project that is a few million tons, which was already quite big, but actually the potential of the S cluster is something that we estimate to be around 27 million tons per year. So it's quite a significant one. But to go back to your question, Tim, so indeed, what we did at OGCI is that we've mapped out the different CO2 sources across 56 countries, mainly in the developing part of the world, because that was one area that we're interested by, and also because the companies that we work with, so within OGCI we work with 12 oil and gas companies, they have a presence in those countries. And so the idea is that we mapped the CO2 sources, the volume of CO2 that was emitted, the quality of the stream, and also what were the storage capacity nearby, and what could be the transportation route to move the CO2 from the emissions to the storage area, and having this cluster hubs approach from the starting point. And then we've modeled the economics behind each of those hubs. So we identified nearly 300 hubs that could be economically viable for something around 7 gigaton of CO2 emissions. So of course it's very significant. But then we've tried to be a little bit conservative in the hypothesis, and looking at the one that economically could make sense from a preferred scale. So basically really looking at the one where the hypotheses are the more stringent. And when you look at that, even with the very conservative hypothesis, we still come up with a number of hubs that accumulate for 1.5 gigaton. So those 1.5 gigaton come as a cost that is below $100 per ton of CO2. So it's something very, very accessible. And when you look at the one that contains cement, so we have not necessarily designed our study for the cement sector. It was broadly speaking for every type of emitters. But if you make a zoom in on the cement sector, 78 of those hubs come with a cement plan, and that could avoid 200 million tons of the cement factories in these hubs. So again, I know that you released, GCCA released its report, I think a few days ago, a great report, by the way. Encourage everybody to read it. That 36% of your volume was associated with CCUS. I think it's an achievable goal.
Thank you, Julien. So that was 56 countries that you did this mapping exercise in. And just to be clear, and those were countries with the OGCI members were active, or was it more countries than that?
So it was countries where OGCI has an active presence, because this is where we could have like access to privileged data, thanks to our member companies who know very well like the subsurface characteristics.
So that's very useful information then that exercise is providing and alerting those countries and those governments to that potential there. So that's very good to hear. And I hope that there's dissemination activities with those outputs, so those governments are made aware and they can include it with confidence in their NDCs when they update their NDCs. So Katherine, developing storage, the storage part of infrastructure, that can be quite a long operation in developing storage. Can you talk about what is needed, and is there any way of making storage assessment faster?
Thanks, Tim. Yes, it is indeed a complex and long activity to try to find storage for your project. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the amount of data that is required to do the assessments. I mean, you need to know that a certain site has injectivity, containment, and capacity. And to do those assessments, you need data. And many times these data are inaccessible. They might be available, but they're privileged information, or they may not even be there at all. So, so that's really something that has been difficult for storage, but it's not just the subsurface. Then the storage is really dependent also on surface conditions. I mean, you need to be able to get leases for that, so you don't want many landowners. And you also need stakeholder engagement. You need the people that are living near the project to accept the project. So it's not just subsurface. There's a lot of things that go into finding storage. So, and when it comes to cement plants are not near historically active storage projects or petroleum projects where we might actually have the data. So what we're doing to help cement find storage is we're starting to look at the more unconventional storage options. So for example, many of the oil and gas infrastructure, many of the facilities that need capture, especially in Texas, are on the coast where we already know a lot about the sediments. But as I said, the cement plants are located elsewhere. And so now we're looking into new areas, new storage targets that might be able to be used. I think another thing, when we look at the global scene, it's really important for governments of countries to be providing enabling environments for CO2, for CCS. If countries themselves are not really on track to do CCS, then cement companies are put in a difficult position because they don't, I mean, they make cement. They're not like oil and gas companies or energy companies that have the expertise, right, to go out and find their own storage. So, so these are some of the aspects that are really, it's a very good question because it's important to be able to accelerate this. So the other things to accelerate this, I think, of course, as always, we need collaboration among all the different stakeholders. We need data exchange. And so we need to be creating that enabling environment in many different ways. I think one of the things that we can be using to accelerate storage is the new technologies, right? Because to get data from the subsurface, it's expensive. And so if you find yourself in an area where you need new data, we need to be able to rely on new technologies for this, you know, new seismic technologies, new ways of being able to get the inputs that we need for the injectivity, the containment, and the capacity.
Thank you very much, Katherine. So that's interesting in the Texas case then. So Texas, which is a state full of pipelines, but the cement companies are interested in more local storage to where their facilities are.
That's exactly right.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, very good. Okay, Beth, over to you now. Can you say about infrastructure developments in Canada? What's the experience and what's going to happen next?
I'm really happy you're not asking me about pipeline specs or storage depths. But yes, absolutely. So in Canada, since 2000, there's actually been 52 million tons of CO2 permanently and safely stored. That's a big deal. And so, there are two hubs that I'll probably talk about that are really important to look to when we're developing other hubs. So sharing information about them, I guess. North Dakota has actually been sending CO2 across the international border. I like to point that out a lot, from the United States to Canada for almost 2 decades. And so with that, 40 million tons of CO2 have been sequestered with that into the Weyburn oil fields, as well as from the Boundary Dam facility. The Boundary Dam facility also sends some of its CO2 to an Aquastore storage site. So there's the ability to have multiple destinations for CO2 coming from one facility. And I think that's also important to be able to explore options. So from that, 500,000 tons has been stored in Aquastore. What's really important is that there's been monitoring using a combination of 3D modeling, 4D seismic monitoring. There's been no induced seismicity. These are very important things when we're trying to show others that this is safe and proven technology. Since 2020, the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line has been operating in Canada, and it's a 240-kilometer pipeline with a capacity of 14.6 million tons a year. It's actually currently only transporting 1.5 million tons a year from 2 different facilities, a refinery and a fertilizer capture, and it's had 4 million tons sequestered from that since its operation. So these things are all happening in tandem. But what I really want to characterize in all of that, there are 400 billion tons of storage in Canada. Only 8 million tons of that is not, characterized so far. Only 8 billion tons of that is not in Western Canada. So a lot of the point sources of emissions, especially from Canada's oil sands, it's a great cement facility in Edmonton you might have heard about, with Heidelberg facilities, are actually located under great storage opportunities. So what we're seeing is the government of Alberta has just issued 25 new hubs. For what they've done is the Crown, the government, has actually taken ownership of the pore space. And so in taking that ownership of the pore space, they're providing a public good and a certainty in the oversight and the regulation of the sequestration. And of those hubs, we're seeing many projects accelerate with other policy mechanisms from government as well, for capital costs, for the capture, et cetera. But what's happening is these partnership dynamics are really coming into play, with the government taking over in the end as well long-term liability. So if those sites are closed, there's also that non-monetary incentive to deliver assurance to the public and to the companies that this will be safety stored and monitored over time. So maybe I'll just end it.
Thanks, Beth. So that's really interesting as well. So the 2 sources now, 2 separate companies to the company that operates the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, are feeding CO2 in. So they must have agreements on CO2 standards, network codes. Do you know if they're public, those standards? Because I think others in the world would be interested to know.
There's a lot of public information attached to it. In fact, the Alberta government, because of attaching any of the dollars to any of these projects, there's public knowledge sharing required from public dollars that go into projects. And so the Alberta government has a knowledge sharing program, which each of those projects have in-depth information, sharing lots of information about specs and capture and of various information, 100%. It's hard to navigate. And so that's what I would say.
So while you've got the mic almost, on the same topic, the International CCS Knowledge Centre has got a dissemination program about to start.
Focused on in the UK, we have legally binding carbon budgets. Our ministers go to jail if they don't meet those, so it focuses the politicians. Underneath that, we've had the pore space has been owned by the Crown permanently. We have a very experienced regulatory regime. Our storage companies are required to assure if they put a molecule in, it stays in, and they have to monitor that for decades after they've filled the store, and then the storage comes to the Crown to own. And if there is a leakage event in all of that time, might be sort of 50, 60 years, then we have a very rigorous emissions trading scheme. So that could be, by then, hundreds of pounds per tonne CO2 emissions. Hopefully a very low probability event, but a very high cost one if it happens. So that's a very, very, very rigorous regime. So the information needed to assure all of those things can happen to meet those science-based targets is very rich. So we're looking at now the 2035 to 2040 horizon. We need to be able to get from that 20 to 30 megatons by 2030 to somewhere between 50 megatons in 2035 to maybe around 100 megatons of injection rate by 2040. Now, a lot of it depends on how the other technologies go. Obviously, nuclear is part of our net zero agenda. Those don't always go to schedule and to time. So we need quite a flexible strategy. So we're in acquiring that knowledge and that assets. We recently launched a very popular licensing round for CO2 storage. So we're lucky to have a lot of potential storage, but getting it through that. So coming back to your question, we haven't found a way of accelerating that 6 to 7 years as it is. We're working very closely, but because of that regime, because of that legal element, we're not that inclined to do it faster, because we want to assure if a molecule has gone in, it stays in. So what we need to do is start earlier so that we can then go through, and that's exactly what we're doing now for that 2035 to 2040 region. But we're blessed with private sector developers who are very keen to do this. They understand the dimension, and then getting that cross-chain risk and balance is what we need to work through.
Thank you very much, Alex. And again, the UK is interesting in that context. And also, I think it's very reassuring that the government of a country is looking so far ahead in such detail to 2040 for the deployment. But in the UK case with the regulator and the permitting, the 21 offshore leases that have, or awards, licenses that have just been awarded, leases, sorry, that licensing round by the North Sea Transition Authority, this is an example of learning by doing. They've been doing it on an ad hoc basis to date. That was the first organised round, and their reflections on that is that they can knock a year off the permitting time to apply and be awarded a permit. So that's one aspect of speeding up by having this forward planning aspect in the UK. So another part of that to take note of. Thank you very much, Alex. So the same question to you, Claude. From your perspective, what can be done to speed up the development of storage infrastructure?
It's a difficult one, but I think that what we heard yesterday, 6 to 7 years, it looks like more like a minimum time rather than a maximum time. And I think we have at least first to be sure that it doesn't take more. And what we are trying to push now as the GCCA is to focus on countries where there is even a lot of work to be done before we can get into those details. So this is typically what we are trying to do with this project now that we are doing in India, where we are much earlier in the chain of action that we need to take, but which is to map where are the cement plants, where are the storage, where are the willing or the companies that feel they're ready, for the first 2-3 carbon capture project in India. Also, where is it the wisest place to start with? Because we hear all those success stories. It all started with a plan that was kind of more ideal than others, or where all conditions were there to make the case to build the first project and the first demo or the first full-scale project. So I think one thing we can do, maybe not to accelerate, but to make sure that we don't start from scratch in 7 years, somewhere, is to do all the prep work for the industry as a whole in a certain region or country, and map out really where are the hubs and where are the potential first sites. And then starting with those examples, then each country will be able to build because what I also see is that we have a lot of different models, and I'm not sure there will be one size fit all solution for every country, every region in the world. It looks like we heard even yesterday from our cement company members who were on the panel that they even said each project will be different. I would at least say each country may find a different solution. Knowledge sharing is important, but then probably we will still see some adaptation or variation of the solution.
I can go straight. Okay. Well, it's a very interesting question. I think I totally agree with what Claude just said, that in terms of preparatory work and making the data available, like doing all this prep. And if you take the parallel with I started my career 20 years back in the solar PV. 20 years back, that was the same question, like where you implement the solar panels, how the ground is flat or not, what is the solar irradiation, the cloud coverage, and all this mapping was necessary at the beginning to enable the solar PV to scale up. And we know that solar PV now is a big success. So this preparatory work is absolutely fundamental. I think another aspect, of course, you have the policy support, obviously, but I'm not going to expand on that. But if we look at what the role of the private sector can do, I think there's probably going to be a role as well for the insurance and the banks sector to standardize a little bit the type of contract that the transport and storage players can claim, because when you are a transport and storage business, your revenue are based on the quantity of CO2 that you get, and so you need to make sure that you receive a continuous stream of CO2 all over the timeline of your project, and you never know whether or not a plant will shut down or a plant will just be moved or so on. So having a form of standardized contract between the emitters and the transport and storage, and or having the insurance company coming on top of it and say, okay, your revenue are more or less secured, don't worry, you can run your transport and storage facility for the next decades and it's going to be fine. I think it's going to be quite important for the business model and make sure that they get financed at the end.
Absolutely. I think in order to accelerate, I couldn't agree more actually with what everybody is saying. The theme I'm hearing is collaboration and working together. And I think what you had mentioned, Tim, about the Carbon Management Challenge is going to be a big part of that. I hope that we can see that happen. One of the things I think for the cement industry is, these players are competitors in a market as well. And so understanding that CCS is at a time when we need to have collaboration as opposed to just pure competition is what really is going to break through to accelerate, especially when it comes to sequestration and storage and transportation even. There are competitive elements that work. Obviously, we need to figure out our tech providers to reduce costs as we have a competitive market. I think that's really important. I also think that, competitive processes that the government of Alberta, for instance, have had for these storage hubs make people interested and ensure that, there's RFP processes and there's due diligence and there are different things in competitive processes that ensure that standards are followed and things are happening. But opening it up to collaboration cannot be, just shut down because you're saying this is competitive. Don't just say this is competitive, it's mine. Realistically, you almost need somebody in your organizations to figure out what you can share. And it's going to be a really big push and important for anybody who ties strings to that money to ensure that that's coming on the other side.
Yeah, and I can't agree with that more. And it's not just strings to the money, but it's strings to the data, you know, because when companies hold data so close that they don't want to share it, then that's a problem. Especially, you know, if you know that data's there but you can't get it, it's really painful. But another thing I just want to bring out about this whole thing is that you can get your storage site assessed. You can screen and you can select and characterize. You can do all of that work. But then when you go to do that project, if you have not done your community outreach and your public, outreach and public acceptance, that project can be shut down. So it's really important to realize that it's not just the technical or economic elements that we need to look at here. And there's examples of that going on right now in Louisiana and Texas, where all of a sudden the incentives for storage have come online and projects are moving forward, but many of these people don't even know what carbon capture and storage is. So I think it's really important they can make informed choices, but my point here is that, again, maybe more to Claude's point, we don't want to move backwards. Maybe it's not an acceleration, but we actually host these projects. You know, can they find jobs? Can they find benefits? So all of that goes into accelerating storage, and it's not just a technical question.
Thanks to in the pipeline to the Weyburn field for many years now. Wouldn't it be nice if they could share some of that contractual arrangements for the CO2 flow, and similar with the Alberta carbon trunk line? So maybe we put that out as an ask to those operators to do that. That will certainly help. And it's also very good to hear Claude's point about helping or working in India, taking the knowledge already from looking at CCS on cement plant and applying that to a country that really does need to abate its emissions and has a lot of cement and a lot of emissions. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So I want to ask if anybody in the audience has any questions for the panel.
I'll pop one to start with. Julien, you mentioned that in your hub work, was it something like 70? Hold on, you mentioned a number of 78 hubs had cement plants, in them. In maybe some had one, some might have a few. And just out of curiosity, is that something that you might have discussed with the cement industry? Have you highlighted these opportunities? Are they sort of really interesting for the cement industry to move forward, since these plants are in those hubs?
So we had some discussion points, yes, with Claude and Thomas in the past. I think we can certainly go deeper, particularly now that you are active in India. It's one of the areas that we are very active in. The thing is that those hubs, as you say, are, designed to cover like multiple sources of emission. So you're going to have cement. I would say that those hubs are happening anyway. Many of them have cement or multiple cement plants. But I think it would be indeed quite interesting to deeper share the knowledge on this. I take that as an action.
Claude Letourneau from Svan. You transfer the liability or the ownership of that CO2?
So the UK, like many places, has the concept of the polluter pays. So at the moment, if an industrial plant emits the CO2, we have an emissions trading scheme. They have to pay £1 per tonne emitted into the atmosphere. We obviously don't want that to happen. So they are currently the polluter. As that molecule transfers from the current emitter to a capture project to the storage company, once they've taken ownership of that molecule, if there's a leakage event, they become the polluter and they pay the emissions trading scheme price in that event. So it's a pretty clear transfer. And the same happens also if it's an international molecule. So if we take, and the UK is lucky, we've got more storage than in aggregate than we have for our own need. the pace at which we can get that storage enabled, one for our own national determined contribution, plus then also making it available international is the race that's on. And the UK is very keen to try and help, in particular Europe, in its decarbonisation. It's got a lot of storage, a lot of capture projects and limited storage, so we want to get our storage available. And then again, the same concept: if a French or a German or a Belgian molecule is captured and then stored in the UK then has that. And again, if there's a major leakage event, that then comes against our inventory, and if then that causes the UK not to meet its net zero 2050, then our ministers are on the hook for that as well. So it's a big liability to take in, not just only the financial but the legal consequences. So we want to make sure that data is there. If the molecule's in, it stays in. All of our research demonstrates that, you know, if done well, it will stay in. But you know, it's a low probability, high impact event, so we want to manage it very well.
Subsequent questions. Sorry to be detailed. So when's the handshake happening between the emitter and the storage? I would assume the transport guys are not liable for the CO2. So that's one question. And then second, how do you backstop the storage liability if the company is not operational, let's say 20 years down the road? Is the government going to backstop this thing?
Yeah, so currently the way we're launching the industry, we have got a combined transport and storage company. So they take it at the factory gate, is where we do it. Different countries have disaggregated it. We will in time disaggregate that, and there'll be a transport company, and then an onshore transport company, an offshore transport company, and a storage company. So we'll get to that, but to start with, we've made it a very clear liability for a transport and storage company. They take it at the factory gate. And then on the long-term element, we have a thing called a government support package, which ultimately the government is the insurer of last resort. But we make sure that some of the money goes through, and there's a fund created, particularly for decommissioning, but then also for events. But ultimately the government is the insurer of last resort. It is for the oil and gas industry today. That's a high value industry. And most of the business models today are part of the enhanced oil recovery industry. We're flipping this to a waste removal industry. And so for cement, if we can get end customers, us, wanting to pay the amount required to have a net zero building because the cement is net zero, then we can build that into the value chain. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to get the taxpayer out of the process and the end customer of that value chain paying it. But ultimately, yeah, government is the insurer of last resort.
So just to add to Alex's points, the transport operator is responsible while the molecules are in the pipeline. And this is interesting because the European Emissions Trading Scheme was the first trading scheme to include CCS in. I was working on that in the mid-2000s, and the European Commission came along and said, because every point source of CO2 in Europe has to buy the allocation to release its CO2, unless it's allocated for some industries. But every ton of CO2 has to have a EU emissions allowance associated with it. And they wanted to permit a CCS project as a single entity. And we realised that we shouldn't do that because there could be different ownership of the different parts of the chain. Obviously, as we all know, captures, transport and storage. And in fact, in the UK case, different regulators for the different part. And the storage side could be the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, the UK government, that the European Emissions Trading Scheme permits as installations capture separately from the transport side, separately from the storage side, because any one of those could become an emitter if there's a leak. And that was based upon pipeline transport, and what's currently happening is they're integrating ship transport into that as well. There's big activity in Europe, and even in the UK's case with Brexit, the UK system has rolled those over into UK legislation, so we've got the same standards and everything as well. So we have a question at the back. Juho, can I ask a favour? Can you be a mic runner? We have a question on the back row. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thanks Tim for handing me the floor, and thanks to the panel. It's a very very interesting conversation, and a very important one, a very timely one as well. I think I'm Shorbujit from the Clean Energy Ministerial Secretariat, and I think the work that the CCUS initiative has been kind of came like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The conversation about transportation was the shipping being the pipelines of the future for many of the kind of fuels of the future. So within the SEM, we have also kind of just launched Clean Energy Marine Hub, fuels of the future, and also to join the dots with regards to the important piece around hubs. And the principle of that is very akin to what you were mentioning, Beth. I think it's one of partnership and collaboration to kind of connect the dots with the work which is also happening on industrial decarbonization, with the work which is happening specifically on the technology solutions on carbon capture. Group also aware that we will be further reaching out to this coalition. It's a very very important coalition. You're kind of knowledge bearers, you're first movers, and you're leaders from the industrial side to kind of further inform this dialogue as we kind of move with the policymakers to shape the conversation. So thanks for that.
Thank you. My name is Anthony Lane. I'm a journalist at Dow Jones. My question is for Alex Milward. How sure are you that UK contractors who are going to be undertaking these CCS projects, other big projects like, say, Hinkley Point C, is there a potential bottleneck there? Thank you.
I think there's obviously a potential bottleneck, which we're working extremely hard. So for many years, there's been a green skills initiative. We have an infrastructure projects authority in the UK that looks across all types of capital expenditure, and we're monitoring and tracking certainly the both industries we can deliver across the elements, and of that billion, quite a large portion of that will be allocated into carbon capture as well. And I think again the UK, again credit to the people before me through the UKRI, the Research and Innovation Fund, have put a lot of money into companies that can create the innovation required for the supply chain. So sort of 2009 investments were being made in carbon capture supply chain projects for the earlier competitions, admittedly, but we're benefiting from that foresight and that investment. We map where we think the pinch points are and where the capacities are. Certainly for the offshore industries, ironically, the high oil and gas prices have then created extra competition and capacity there. When we monitor that, we believe the capacity is there, but unfortunately we're going to have to probably pay a higher price than we would have done otherwise. So the capacity is there, but it becomes a price. But we monitor it closely because certainly if there's a critical element of the supply chain that's not there, then the whole program can get back. So we're looking at it very closely and hopefully avoiding the bottlenecks.
So that was a great question. Thanks for that. And it helps if a country has an established oil and gas industry. There's a lot of related relevant expertise there. And if the oil and gas production is reducing, then that human resource started there. I mean, we do our little bit as IEAGHG with our summer schools. We've got 640 alumni now around the world from 14 summer schools. Katherine, you do courses on repurposing oil and gas professionals. Can I ask you just to say a little bit about those?
In knowing that, we have been developing professional development courses to help oil and gas professionals to repurpose their skills for CO2 storage. And it was really interesting because there's a very high demand for this. And we developed this course, and then we've given, in the past 2 years, I think we've given this 5 half-day course probably about 20 times already. So there is a high demand for this type of information, so yeah.
Okay, I think we're about up to time. Oh, Thomas, as the boss of GCCA, you definitely get a question.
It's a question. I know the answer because I was in one of the former panel, but I think it's important because we talk about leakage, we talk about from a politician. I mean, it's or from a government. It's normal that we think that. But I would like to ask you, Katherine, to yesterday you talked about leakage, the risk of leakage on the certainty you have around the storage reservoir, and I would like to repeat that. So my question is, what is the risk of leakage? I mean, how about the occurrence?
Thanks for that question. I appreciate that. Yes, many people think that CO2 storage is really new, but really we have a lot of experience with it. And we've looked to collect it not into large caverns, which some people might think, but in between the little spaces, in between the grains of the rocks of the subsurface formation. So there's many different trapping mechanisms, and that CO2, it's very hard. You couldn't even get it out if you really wanted to in many times. One of the analogs I can give you to understand kind of CO2 in a pore space is that if you're making a sandwich, and you want to spread some mayonnaise on your sandwich, and then maybe your friend comes over and wants a sandwich, and you don't have enough mayonnaise, and you try to scrape.
Time now, so I'd like to thank the panel, and I'd like you to thank the panel. So Alex, Juho, can we show our appreciation to the panel? Thank you very much.
I'll just take the final seconds to remind everybody that this is a series of events. Tomorrow we convene in the same space, 9 a.m. sharp, for the third event in our series, which is on enabling policy frameworks to accelerate CCUS and cement. That's going to be largely around incentives, and we will have Heidelberg Materials, Holcim, UK CCSA, Mitsubishi UFG Bank, and ClearPath, which is a US-based think tank, to discuss those matters tomorrow at 9 o'clock. So welcome everybody. Thanks to the panel and thanks to the audience. Thank you.
And thank you again, everyone.